The grand hall of the Interstellar Academy was packed. Students, faculty, and scholars from over 100 species had gathered, their bioluminescent eyes, swirling tendrils, and chitinous limbs all focused on the center stage. At the podium stood Dr. Vral Thun, an elder of the revered Zelthari species, known for their vast intellect and even greater arrogance. She smirked, her four mandibles clicking together in what passed for amusement among her kind. Today was a special day. She would prove once and for all that humans were intellectually inferior. Her target? Cadet James Carter. Carter sat at the center of the hall, legs casually stretched, arms crossed. The single human student in the academy, he was seen as a curiosity. Nothing more than a biological anomaly among the hyper-intelligent species of the galaxy. For the past term, Dr. Vral Thun had tolerated the human's presence. But when the final exam results came in, she saw an opportunity. Carter had failed, or so she thought. The screen behind her lit up, displaying Carter's final examination, a mass of seemingly random numbers, ones and zeros. The audience erupted into snickers and whispers. Typical human stupidity. Did he really just hit random keys? I knew it. Humans are nothing but brutes. No match for the intellect of the galactic elite. Dr. Vral Thun raised a clawed hand, silencing the crowd. Her multi-lensed eyes gleamed with satisfaction. This was her moment. She turned to Carter, amplifying her voice. Cadet Carter, she said with exaggerated patience. Would you care to explain why your examination consists of nonsense? Or did you finally admit that humans are incapable of true intellectual rigor? More chuckles from the crowd. Some students were outright laughing. Carter remained silent. He tapped his fingers on the table, staring at the screen with a faint, almost amused smile. Vral Thun smirked. This was too easy. She gestured dramatically to the screen. For those unfamiliar, this response is nothing but primitive gibberish. I'd expected at least some effort. Instead, I received this insult to academia. She zoomed in on the first few lines, making the massive wall of ones and zeros take up the entire screen. Let's take a closer look, shall we? She said mockingly. The audience roared with laughter. She turned back to Carter, waiting for him to fumble through an excuse. He didn't. He simply leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Then he spoke. Are you sure you want me to explain it? The laughter died down slightly. Some aliens exchanged confused glances. Vral Thun scoffed. Enlighten us then. Carter sighed, stretched his arms behind his head, and said in a calm, almost bored voice, You're looking at the answers in the wrong format. Silence then from somewhere in the audience. An alien tech specialist frowned and muttered, Wait, that looks familiar. The screen remained filled with ones and zeros. Something was wrong. The laughter stopped. And Dr. Vral Thun? For the first time in her life, she felt uneasy. The room, once filled with laughter and smug whispers, had gone eerily silent. Hundreds of alien scholars, students, and high-ranking officials of the Interstellar Academy now stared at the massive screen, their expressions shifting from amusement to confusion. The exam results that had been so easily dismissed as gibberish were suddenly under scrutiny. Dr. Vral Thun's mandibles twitched. She had expected Carter to stammer, to make excuses, to perhaps even admit defeat. Instead, the human sat there, completely unfazed. The subtle arrogance of his calmness made her uneasy. She turned toward the audience. A desperate attempt to save face, she announced, voice sharp and dismissive. But very well. Let's humor the human. Cadet Carter, she said, emphasizing his inferior status. Explain to us how this nonsense is anything but proof of human incompetence. Carter tilted his head slightly, watching her the way a predator might watch prey that hadn't yet realized it was being hunted. Then, without looking at the screen, he recited the first line of binary from memory. A gasp rippled through the audience. As the Academy's linguistic specialist, a four-eyed Zirian instinctively began translating. His glowing blue skin flickered erratically as the realization hit him. He looked at Carter, then back at the screen. It's written in binary, he murmured, his voice laced with shock. That phrase, it translates to, Holy shit! Murmurs spread through the room. the aliens shifting uncomfortably as more and more of them started to realize the implications. Carter smirked. I thought that was an appropriate first response. Vralthun's claws clenched, her composure cracking. Impossible, she hissed. Why would you write an exam in binary code? Carter finally stood up, stretching like he had all the time in the world. Because, Professor, he said lazily, your exam instructions said to answer in the most efficient format possible. Vralthun froze. The realization hit like a shockwave. She had indeed written those exact words in the instructions. But no one had considered binary an acceptable format for a written exam. Every species used some form of structured script or symbolic representation. But humans had been communicating with machines for centuries. And in terms of efficiency, nothing beat binary. The Zirian linguistic specialist quickly ran another conversion, translating the second and third lines. His bioluminescence flared in sudden panic. He's answered the entire exam this way, he stammered. And it's correct. Every answer is accurate. The murmur in the audience turned into outright disbelief. Carter leaned against the podium, watching as the aliens scrambled to check their data. You told me to be efficient, he said, voice full of amused indifference. Did you really expect a species that spent half its history programming computers not to take that literally? Vralthun felt the weight of 100 gazes on her. Her carefully crafted humiliation of the human was collapsing in real time. No, she snapped. This is a trick. No species would naturally process information like this. It is illogical, impractical. And yet, Carter interrupted, I still passed, didn't I? Silence. The Zirian double-checked the results and nodded. Technically, yes, he admitted. Every answer is provided an entirely accurate mathematical format. He turned to Vralthun, his expression unreadable. There is no rule against this. Vralthun's mandibles flared. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. She had set out to humiliate the human, to prove their inferiority to the galaxy's intellectual elite. But now it was her credibility that was unraveling. Carter, sensing her frustration, shrugged. I mean, if you really want to fail me for following your exact instructions to the letter, go ahead. But that would kind of prove that humans are better at playing by your own rules than you are. A murmur of laughter rippled through the crowd, and just like that, the power shifted. The professor, once standing as the undeniable authority in this hall, now struggled to maintain control. Because the truth was undeniable. Humans weren't just unpredictable. They were dangerous in ways the galaxy hadn't even begun to understand. For a long moment, no one spoke. The vast lecture hall, once filled with smug amusement at the humans' impending humiliation, now crackled with an almost tangible tension. Scholars, students, and high-ranking officials of the Interstellar Academy sat frozen, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and deep, unsettling realization. Dr. Vralthun, still standing at the podium, refused to accept this outcome. Her mandibles clicked together as she clenched her claws, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't possible. The human had taken an exam meant to test abstract theoretical knowledge and had answered it entirely in binary code, the language of machines. And somehow, that was correct. The Zirian linguistic specialist continued translating, his bioluminescent skin flashing erratically as he scrolled through the exam's binary responses. His tentacle-like fingers trembled over his datapad. Every answer is not just correct, it's optimized. His voice was tinged with awe. The equations aren't just solved, they're compressed to their most efficient computational form. Another alien, a high-ranking logician from the Academy's mathematics department, spoke up. His voice was carefully neutral, but his third eye twitched with barely restrained curiosity. Cadet Carter, did you memorize this entire exam in binary? Carter gave him a lazy shrug. Sort of? It's just easier that way. A ripple of shock spread through the room. Easier? Vralthun spat the word as though it was an insult. You expect us to believe that converting high-level theoretical data into machine language was easier than simply writing it out? Carter sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose like he was explaining something to a particularly dense child. Look, Professor, humans invented digital computing centuries ago. Binary is second nature to us. we don't even have to think about it. It's how our computers work, how we process vast amounts of data, how we send messages across light years. He gestured to the screen. This is just me answering in the format that makes the most sense for efficiency. Your mistake was assuming that we think like you. That last sentence sent a shudder through the room. Because that was the problem, wasn't it? They had all assumed wrongly that humans thought within the same parameters as every other known species. That they would at best struggle to keep up with the intellectual giants of the galaxy. But this wasn't struggle. This was adapting the test itself into something entirely different. The realization spread slowly, chillingly. If humans thought in binary as effortlessly as breathing, what else could they do? A Kalari strategist, one of the war analysts who had been evaluating humanity's military potential, leaned forward. "Cadet Carter, humor me," he said, his deep-set eyes narrowing. "How fast can you perform complex calculations in your head using binary?" Carter blinked. Depends on the calculation." "Why?" The strategist's scaled fingers tapped against the metal armrest of his chair. "Because if your brain can process and store information in a format compatible with artificial intelligence, then theoretically," the Zirian linguistics specialist cut in, his voice suddenly frantic. Wait! His glowing blue tendrils quivered as he pulled up additional analysis on the exam responses. His next words sent an electric charge through the room. His answers, they're not just binary. Silence, Dr. Vralthun stiffened. "Explain," she demanded. The Zirian's bioluminescence flared wildly. There's a secondary structure encoded beneath the primary responses. It's self-referential. Some of these equations, they optimize themselves mid-calculation. He turned to Carter, his tendrils quivering in something very close to fear. "Did you do this intentionally?" Carter frowned. "I mean, kinda? Some of the more complex problems work better with recursion, so I let them fold into a self-correcting pattern." He scratched his head. "It's just basic algorithmic compression. Basic. Algorithmic compression?" A new kind of horror settled over the room. Because if this was basic to humans, what was their advanced capacity? The Kalari strategist's gaze hardened. "This means humans don't just use computers. You think like them," Carter smirked. "And yet, unlike AI, we're unpredictable." That was it, at a breaking point. Ripple of alarm spread through the gathered academics, strategists, and scientists. Every species in the known galaxy has struggled with artificial intelligence. Too rigid, too predictable, too lacking in adaptability. But if humans thought it in a way that mirrored machine logic while maintaining organic intuition and creativity, they weren't just another species. They were something else entirely. Vralthun felt her world tilting. This wasn't just an embarrassing mistake. This was a fundamental error in how the galaxy had perceived humanity. She had tried to humiliate the human, to break him in front of the most esteemed intellectuals of the Academy. Instead, she had accidentally exposed a secret that could shake the very foundation of the Galactic Order. Humans didn't just think differently. They thought beyond. The news traveled fast. What was supposed to be a simple academic evaluation, a routine humiliation of a lesser species, had turned into a diplomatic crisis. Within hours, Galactic Command was made aware of the incident at the Interstellar Academy. By the next cycle, the highest-ranking officials of the Confederation had convened in a classified session, reviewing the transcript of the examination and its terrifying implications. Admiral Zauren of the Unified Defense Council leaned forward, his scaled hands clasped tightly together. "Let me summarize the situation," he growled. The human cadet Carter didn't just pass the test. He rewrote the fundamental approach to problem-solving mid-exam. His responses weren't just correct, they were self-optimizing. A heavy silence followed. High Chancellor Ovrak, a veteran of countless species integration efforts, exhaled slowly. "And we confirmed that this binary computation method is natural to humans?" The Zirian intelligence officer present at the table nodded, his glowing tendrils pulsing with unease. "Humans don't just use machine logic, they think in it. And what's worse," he hesitated, "they do it instinctively." Another long pause. For centuries, the Confederation had prided itself on understanding the strengths and weaknesses of every species within its domain. biological limitations, intellectual capacities, and psychological thresholds. Every factor had been studied, categorized, and controlled. But this was a blind spot, a catastrophic miscalculation. General Urak, the supreme strategist of the CEU, Confederation's military forces, finally spoke. His voice was unnervingly calm. If humans think in binary, if they process information faster and more efficiently than our best AI systems, then we are not dealing with a standard species. His 4 black eyes narrowed. We are dealing with something that has the capacity to outthink us all. The weight of his words settled like a black hole over the room. Species after species had struggled with AI governance. Machines, no matter how advanced, were predictable, limited by logic, lacking the adaptability of organic minds. But now, they faced an organic species that had the best of both worlds: creativity and computational efficiency, instinct and algorithmic precision, flexibility and unbreakable logic. One of the economic advisors, an insectoid chirk with a nervous tick in his mandibles, clicked out a question in a rapid burst of his language. The translation echoed through the chamber. What does this mean? For our strategic dominance, Admiral Zalren answered without hesitation. It means that if humanity is not on our side, they are the single greatest threat the Confederation has ever faced. No one argued, because for the first time in history, they were all thinking in binary. The Confederation had always operated under a simple truth. Every species had a breaking point, a limit to their endurance, a threshold where their willpower faltered, their intelligence plateaued, or their bodies failed. It was the natural order of things. Humans, however, were proving to be an anomaly. Deep within the Confederation's Strategic Intelligence Command, analysts pored over the latest findings from the Interstellar Academy incident. Every data point, every neurological scan, and every psychological evaluation of the human cadet Carter painted the same disturbing picture. There was no off switch, not just in a literal sense, though that was troubling enough. Most species had a biological safeguard, a built-in failsafe that prevented them from pushing too far, whether through exhaustion, stress, or sheer mental strain. It was a necessary limitation for survival. Even the most advanced AI systems required periodic recalibration to prevent catastrophic failures in their logic. Humans, however, were something else entirely. Their brains didn't just work harder under stress. They worked better. The alien scientists assigned to study Carter's test results initially thought his responses were the result of prior knowledge, some hidden advantage or pre-learned information. But after deeper analysis, the truth became evident. He wasn't recalling answers. He was generating them in real time, optimizing his problem solving as he went, and rewriting his own cognitive pathways on the fly. And this wasn't a rare genius level exception. It was a species-wide trait. Hi. Chancellor Ovrak stared at the report, his fingers tapping against the cold metal table in agitation. Explain to me, he said slowly, addressing the chief intelligence officer, why our simulations have failed to predict this. The Xerian officer, whose bioluminescent tendrils dimmed in unease, hesitated. Because we assume that all species, including humans, require limits. That intelligence follows predictable patterns. That stress is an obstacle, not a catalyst. Ovrak's jaw tightened. What about burnout? What about cognitive overload? Surely there must be a threshold. We tested that. The officer interrupted grimly. Humans don't break the way other species do. Instead of shutting down, they adapt. They become more efficient under pressure. Their minds restructure to handle higher loads. The more we push, the better they perform. A heavy silence filled the chamber. It was a terrifying realization. For centuries, the Confederation had relied on systemic control to maintain order, societal pressure, bureaucratic hurdles, and carefully monitored intellectual ceilings ensured no species could ever rise too quickly. No civilization could challenge the existing hierarchy. But humans? They had no ceiling. Ovrak turned to General Urak, whose expression had darkened considerably. And in a military setting, the general exhaled slowly. If their intellectual resilience mirrors their physical endurance, then we have a serious problem. Every species in the Confederation had an exhaustion threshold. Soldiers, no matter how well trained, would reach a point where pain, fatigue, or emotional trauma would render them ineffective. Even war machines, battle-tested AI systems, had operational limits. But the human combat records told a different story. Humans fought long after their bodies should have failed. Their endurance wasn't just physical, it was mental, strategic, adaptive. They learned mid-battle, they improved during combat, they would not stop. Overak closed his eyes. And if war comes? General Urak's voice was quiet, but his words carried the weight of history. If war comes, we'll be fighting a species that does not quit. A species that gets smarter, stronger, and more efficient the longer the war drags on. He hesitated before adding, which means there are only two options. Overak looked at him sharply. And they are? The general's four black eyes narrowed. Either we ally with humanity at all costs, or we pray to every god in the galaxy that we never make them our enemy. For as long as the Confederation had existed, there had been one universal. Our truth in warfare. Every army has a breaking point. It didn't matter how strong a species was. Given enough time, enough losses, and enough pressure, they would eventually crack. And yet the humans never did. Confederation strategists had expected. It relied on it when they first engaged humanity in battle. They planned their campaigns around attrition tactics, slowly grinding down enemy morale until surrender became the only logical choice. It worked against every species. Every war followed the same cycle. Initial resistance, mounting casualties. Deteriorating morale, surrender, but against the humans, there was no surrender. The first major battle should have been decisive. Confederation forces outnumbered their human opponents 3-1. Their supply lines were intact, their ships technologically superior, and their battle simulations predicted a 93% probability of human retreat within the first 72 hours. The end of the third day, something impossible had happened. The humans were still fighting. By the end of the fifth day, the humans had adapted. By the end of the 10th day, the Confederation was losing. It wasn't that the humans didn't feel fear. Confederation psychological analysis confirmed that they did. They suffered pain, exhaustion, and grief. Their bodies wore down. Their resources dwindled, but instead of breaking, they became more dangerous. Confederation commanders watched in horror as human tactics shifted mid-battle. Where other species would crumble under pressure, humans evolved. They turned defeats into lessons, losses into fuel. Their soldiers fought harder when things got worse. The final crushing moment came when a human officer, wounded, outnumbered, and cut off from reinforcements, was expected to surrender. Instead, she sent a single message to her remaining troops. Hold the line! And they did, for 4 more days, with no reinforcements, with no supplies, with no hope of survival. They should have collapsed. But they didn't. They fought until Confederation forces were forced to retreat. The breaking point. The moment where the humans would finally falter. Where their willpower would snap never came. Because as the Confederation now understood far too late, humans don't break. They endure. The Confederation had spent centuries believing that victory was a matter of numbers, technology, and superior strategy. They had fought countless wars, crushed countless enemies, and expanded their reach across the stars. But now, standing at the edge of a war they could not win, they faced an impossible truth. Humanity wasn't the strongest species. They weren't the most advanced. But they were something far, far worse for any enemy. They were relentless. Every attempt to outmaneuver, outlast, or outthink them had failed. Every strategy designed to wear them down had only made them fight harder. They refused to surrender. They refused to break, and so the Confederation faced the only choice left. They could continue the war, a war that would never end, a war that would only drain them until there was nothing left, or they could do what every rational species did when faced with something that could not be stopped. They could sue for peace. The decision wasn't made in a war room, nor in a grand council meeting. It was made in the fear-filled silence of those who had seen the battlefield firsthand, those who had fought, those who had lost, and those who had learned the only lesson humanity had to teach. The official statement was carefully worded, a mutual ceasefire, a diplomatic resolution, a new era of cooperation. But everyone knew the untruth. This was not a peace treaty. It was a surrender, wrapped in polite words, signed with shaking hands, and sealed with the unspoken knowledge that the Confederation had been given only one chance to walk away. And they took it. The official records tell one story. They say that war was avoided through diplomacy, that the Confederation and humanity reached a peaceful resolution after a brief but intense conflict. But the truth, the one whispered in dark halls and shadowed corners, is something else entirely. Confederation did not negotiate because they wanted peace. They negotiated because they had no other choice. The humans never surrendered. They never stopped. Historians across the galaxy would analyze the events for decades, trying to make sense of what happened. How could a young, technologically inferior species bring the Great Confederation to its knees? How could an army so outnumbered fight with such ruthless, terrifying efficiency? No one could explain it. The official reports were filled with vague terminology, unexpected tactical adaptability, high-risk combat engagement strategies, psychological resilience beyond projected norms. But among the officers who had seen it firsthand, a different phrase took hold: the myth of the unstoppable humans. It was no longer a military theory or a battlefield rumor. It became legend. New cadets were taught about it in hushed tones. It was the thing lurking in every war room, the unspoken fear in every high command meeting. The idea that no matter what you threw at them, humans would always find a way to survive. They were the ones who didn't know how to stop. The ones who didn't break, the ones who didn't lose. For years after the war, border skirmishes and conflicts arose across the Confederation. But one thing remained constant. No one wanted to fight humans. Even those who had never seen them in battle had heard the stories. Entire military campaigns were abandoned at the mere rumor that human forces might be deployed. Treaties were signed before a single shot was fired. In the grand halls of the Confederation, leaders would glance at each other, at the war proposals laid before them, and ask a single terrifying question: what if the humans get involved? It was no longer about strategy, no longer about firepower or fleet size. It was about something far more primal: fear. And so humanity was left alone, not out of respect, not out of diplomacy, but because the galaxy had learned a truth so chilling, so absolute, that it reshaped interstellar politics. Forever, you don't fight humans, not if you want to win, not if you want to survive.